Welcome to our Western Frontier um, lecture. This is for the chapter America Expands. We're going to focus mainly on the expansion west. Towards the end, I will talk a little bit about American imperialism. It occurs the same time that Europe is involved in imperialism, but we have a much smaller window of time in which America is involved. But right now we're going to primarily talk about the westward expansion of the United States from the Civil War period until the early 1900s. There's a lot of changes that we see on the frontier during that time. Okay, so we need to establish a few things first. There's going to be a culture clash on the prairie. It's going to be a culture clash because the Plains Indians are already going to be there. They have been there for years, hundreds of years. Their homeland. They have a culture that has developed there. But this is going to be the same area that American settlers are going to be moving to and trying to settle. The way of life is going to change first for the Plains Indians when horses and guns are introduced. And that's going to happen when the Spanish come. When the Spanish come, they bring guns and they bring horses with them. And some of those horses are left to roam free, which eventually results in many wild herds of horses. And the Indians figure out how to capture some of those horses and how to tame them and utilize them for transportation. Guns are going to be introduced into the Indian way of life through trade, primarily. Tribes are going to begin to roam the plains and hunt buffalo. Buffalo are going to be essential for the Plains Indians. It's the kind of the centerpiece of their way of life. Okay, so buffaloes are going to provide meat, clothing, shoes, blankets. The Indians are going to use every part of the buffalo. The fur is going to be used for clothing for the winter when it's cold. The bones and antlers are going to be used for tools or for musical instruments or for ornaments. The fat will be used for cooking. The meat will be used for eating. They'll either eat it fresh or make a jerky out of it. The sinew or the tendons will be used for thread. And needles will be made out of either stones or the bones of the buffalo. So every part of the buffalo is going to be used. The buffalo is central to life on the plains. And there are millions of buffalo running around. The herds are enormous. Family life of the natives on the plains. They usually are going to live in small family groups with ties to other bands that speak the same language. It's the same thing we've seen since studying in geography. You have a tribe, which is several groups that are related to each other and speak the same language. And then it moves on up. Sorry, you have a clan. Then that's related to each other, then that moves on up to a tribe, which are several clans that work together. Young men are going to become hunters and warriors. That's their primary job. They are to hunt the food. They are to protect the tribe. They become the warriors fighting with other tribes over hunting lands and different things like that, and they're going to hunt for the food. The women are going to butcher the game, prepare the hides. Sometimes the women get to choose their own husbands. Sometimes the husbands choose their own wives. Sometimes it's an arrangement between elders. That's going to vary from tribe to tribe. But generally, we're going to see that the women's jobs are butchering the animals, processing the meat, preparing the hides for use in other things. All right, so the settlers are going to start moving out west. Now, we saw this with Manifest Destiny up until the Mexican-American War. After the Mexican-American War, that's going to spark the controversy or bring to light the issue of slavery and how controversial it is, because the question is going to be, should these newly acquired Western territories be allow slavery or not allow slavery. And the argument over that is going to culminate in the Civil War. And so there's not going to be a huge amount of settlement that's going to happen from the Mexican-American War until the end of the Civil War. There's going to be some, certainly enough to start the controversy, but it's not going to be a huge movement. However, during the Civil War and shortly thereafter, there is going to be a mass exodus. People are going to be massively moving out west, and these settlers are going to be moving out west. Some of that is going to be because of something that's going to be called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act promises, I believe it's 160 acres to any settler that will go and live on the land for 5 years and improve it by building a home and farming the land. They don't have to pay for the land. All they have to do is live on it for 5 years, build a house, and farm the land. And then it's theirs. Can you go back, please? Sorry. Settlers wanted to own their own land after the war. Many don't have land, and remember, not everybody in the South owned land before the war, and not everybody in the North owned land, and land had become a lot more scarce as the population had grown, and so people wanted to own their own land, but they didn't necessarily have the money to go and buy it, and so things like the Homestead Act provided them the opportunity to own their own land. In addition, in the late 1850s, gold was discovered in Colorado, and so many settlers traveled west for that gold rush. And mining became a huge reason for moving out west. So getting new land and farming was a big reason, and another reason would be mining. And so this is a picture of a mining camp out west. Just kind of gives you an idea of how primitive and rough it could be. But mining camps opened up. Mining camps ruined the look of the land because they're digging, they're mining for these precious metals. Immigrants of every kind came to the camps. Everybody was hoping to strike it rich. Primarily, they were looking for gold, but there would be other minerals or gold. Other precious metals that would be prevalent. Lead, zinc, silver were some of them. Women actually could own businesses out in this area. They did things like own laundries, hardware stores, freight hauling businesses. They were able to take advantage of so many people coming in the area and needing these services. So that actually opened up an opportunity for many women to own businesses out west. And many cities evolved or formed around these mining camps, like Virginia City, Nevada, and Helena, Montana. Okay, but we said that the Native Americans were already out in the West. Some of them had lived there for hundreds of years. Some of them we had put there with the Trail of Tears out in Oklahoma. So the government realizes that this is a problem. We've got a clash between the Indians and the settlers, and so the government's answer is to restrict Native Americans. Some of the influences on government policies towards the Native Americans is going to be the westward movement of the settlers and the arrival of the railroads. After the Civil War, this idea of a transcontinental railroad really took off, and the government got behind it, and that meant dealing with the Native American issue. In the 1850s, the government had created treaties that defined specific boundaries for each tribe. Now, many of the tribes ignored the treaties and continued to hunt on their own lands that they had had before. When they did that, they would clash with the miners and the settlers that had moved into that area. So what the government had done was they had created these treaties, and they said, okay, this is Sioux land, this is Apache land, this is Comanche land, and you can hunt and live in those areas. But over here, this is where our settlers are going to be, this is where our miners can be, and you can't come over here. The problem was all that land had belonged to the tribes before, had been their hunting lands. Remember, buffalo was central to the Indian way of life, to the Plains way of life, so wherever the buffalo went, the Indians needed to be able to go. And the miners didn't want the buffalo there because they were trying to mine, and the farmers didn't want the buffalo in their area because that tore up their crops, and so they would try and get rid of the buffalo, and they would try and keep the Indians away from that area as well. So it was just a clash all the way around. Okay, so there was a massacre at Sand Creek. In 1864, the Cheyenne returned to Colorado's Sand Creek Reserve for the winter. They thought that they were under government protection. However, Army Commander S.R. Curtis sent a telegram to Colonel John Shivington stating that I want no peace till the Indians suffer more. So the Indians think we're on the reserve, we're under the protection of the government. However, there were some officials within the U.S. Army who did not like Indians. Racism against the Indians was huge at the time. It was much more prevalent than racism against the Africans, against the blacks. And so Shivington says, I want no peace till the Indians suffer more. In other words, I don't care. We're not gonna let them have a peaceful winter. So Shivington attacks the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. 200 warriors, 500 women and children were there. 150 people were killed. Most of them were women and children massacred. Now, then you have the instance of death on the Bozeman Trail. This is a trail that goes through Sioux hunting grounds in what are called the Bighorn Mountains. Red Cloud was the Sioux chief, and he had asked the government to end white settlement in the area or on the trail, and the government didn't agree. This is a picture of the trail today. So in December of 1866, Crazy Horse actually ambushes Captain William J. Fetterman and his company that are at the Lodge Trail Ridge. During this encounter, 80 soldiers were killed, or a little more than 80 soldiers were killed. And the natives called this the Battle of 100 Slain. The whites called it the Fetterman Massacre. So this is a picture of Crazy Horse, the man, not the horse. The skirmishes continued until the government agreed to actually close the trail. And this happens with the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Now, you've probably heard of Fort Laramie if you've ever watched any old westerns. They talk about Fort Laramie a lot in the old westerns. The Sioux agreed to live on the reservation along the Missouri River in 1868 under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Sitting Bull was the leader of a group of the Sioux, and he never signed the treaty. So, from 1874 to 1875, we have what's called the Red River War. And this is the result of the Kiowa, or Apache, and the Comanche raiding for 6 years. I'm sorry, the Kiowa are not the Apache. I'm sorry, I mixed that up. The Kiowa is another name for Sioux, not Apache. So the Kiowa and the Comanche were had been raiding the area for 6 years. The U.S. responds by putting people from friendly tribes on the reservations and then opened fire on the rest of the tribes. So what they did was the tribes that weren't giving them any problems, the U.S. put those tribes on reservations so they knew that they weren't giving them any problems, and then anybody who wasn't on the reservation was fired upon. They were attacked. Orders were given to destroy villages and ponies, kill and hang all the warriors, and bring back all the women and children. And most of the resistance on the plains at the time was crushed because of this. So let's go back to the miners. The miners had been searching for gold in the Black Hills. And the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho had protested the miners being there. But the government, again, would not do anything about it. And so we have Custer. Custer is one of my least favorite people. We have what's called the Custer's Last Stand. Now, Custer had been actually had risen to the rank of general in the Civil War for the Union. At the end of the Civil War, when the war was over and the ranks of the Union Army was reduced, he actually was reduced back down to the rank of colonel, and he became a prominent Indian fighter. And he hated Indians. He hated the natives. He did not think that any Indian should be left alive, and he was famous for massacring them. But during this mining that's going on in the Black Hills, it's going to cause more confrontations with the Indians, and this is going to cause a problem that is going to involve Custer. The Sioux War is from 1876 to 1877, and it's mainly famous for its participants, some of whom we've already spoken of, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull generally led negotiations. Crazy Horse tended to be the commander of the warriors. And then Colonel Custer was the commander of the Union Army troops that engaged in most of these battles. The major battle is Little Bighorn, June 25th, 1876. Custer wants to attack the Indian camp, but his scouts warn that the Indian camp is actually too big. There's too many people there. He says there are more Indians than Custer's men have bullets. So they reach Little Bighorn River. The Native Americans actually had already seen them coming. They already knew that they were coming. They also knew Custer liked to divide his forces when he attacked. And so Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and Gall, who was another leader that was there, were all ready for Custer. Custer divides his troops as he normally did. He gives Major Marcus Reno a group, and he tells them to attack the camp head on. And Reno actually suffers major losses, but he is the luckier out of the two, because Custer takes 200 men with him, and he's going to attack north of the camp. Unfortunately for Custer, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull already knew that he was going to do this. They already knew he was coming, and they had a huge force waiting on him. And this time, it was Custer and his men who were killed. Custer and all 200 of his men were killed. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse had known he was coming, and this was a huge victory for them. It was put forth as a massacre back home. This is a rendition of Custer's last stand. However, the Sioux do not win the Sioux Wars. What winds up happening is they think they've actually won, and so they kind of disperse and go back home and stop being a united force. But Little Bighorn resonates back with the American people as being a massacre against their soldiers, and it kind of renews their efforts against the Sioux Indians. And in 1876, the Sioux are actually beaten. Sitting Bull and some followers went to Canada, and they remained there until 1881. But eventually, Sitting Bull has to come back and is forced to surrender to keep his people from starving. This is one of the Sioux, Gall, that was listed as one of the leaders at Little Bighorn. This is a quote from him. This is what he said. He said, "We've been taught to hunt and live on the game. You tell us we must learn to farm, live in one house, and take on your ways. Suppose the people living beyond the great sea should come and tell you, you must stop farming and kill your cattle and take your houses and lands. What would you do? Would you not fight them?" So the government's policy supports assimilation. Now that they've won the Indian Wars, they've got the natives on reservations, they have to figure out what to do with them. And so they decide that the policy of assimilation is the best policy. And this is a plan where the Native Americans would have to give up their beliefs, their way of life, and take on the white culture, the European culture. They'd have to start wearing European clothes and farming and living in houses and living the way that the settlers were living. It's called assimilation. And so the Dawes Act actually comes out in 1887. Now the Dawes Act is actually a response. It's a response to a piece that was written by Helen Hunt Jackson. In 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson writes a piece called A Century of Dishonor, where she exposes the dishonorable way that the American government had dealt with the natives for many, many, many years. And so as a response in 1887, the Dawes Act is passed by Congress to try and kind of make up for some of this. And what it did was it broke up the reservations into individual plots of land, and they gave those individual plots of land to the Native Americans, to families. They'd each get 160 acres. Each had a household would get 160 acres. And if you were an unmarried adult, you got 80 acres. Then the rest of the land, after the reservation land was divvied up between these individuals, the rest of the land could be sold to settlers in the area. The income from selling of the land could be used to help the Native Americans buy farm implements. So there's still this idea that the natives have to assimilate. They still have to become farmers and like everybody else, but now we're going to give them their own individual land. The problem with that is that the Native Americans never had an idea of individual ownership of land. They believed the land belonged to everybody, and the closest thing they had to individual ownership of land was that certain hunting grounds belonged to certain tribes. But that was more practical than, that was more out of practicality than out of the sense that somebody should own the land. It was not practical for all the tribes to be trying to hunt in the same area. Nobody would have enough food, nobody would have enough room. And so practicality dictated that each tribe would have their own hunting grounds. But they never really had this idea of private land ownership. And so the Dawes Act really doesn't work very well. This is a poster that shows the selling of the Indian land. I'm sorry, can you go back? Most of the time what happened, though, was when their land was being sold, the reservation land, leftover reservation land was being sold, the Indians actually never got any of that money. So the intention was supposed to be there, but it was never really carried out the way it was supposed to be. Okay, so the wars, the battles, were definitely significant in subduing the Native Americans and getting the land from them and changing their way of life. But actually the most significant blow was the destruction of the buffalo, because their life centered around the buffalo. Once the buffalo was gone, they didn't have anything to eat, they didn't have any way to make clothes, they didn't have any way to make shelter. Everything was gone. And there's multiple ways that the buffalo were destroyed. Excuse me. The U.S. encouraged the destruction of the herds to get rid of the Indians and to allow for the railroads. And so tourists and fur traders came and shot them for sport. As the railroads moved west, people would literally shoot buffalo out of the window of the train car and just leave them there to rot. In 1800, there were 65 million buffalo on the plains. By 1890, just 90 years later, there were less than 1,000 buffalo. And by 1900, there was only one wild herd left. The decimation of the buffalo within 100 years was massive. The Sioux suffered from poverty and disease. A lot of that was because they didn't have proper nutrition. They didn't have the food that they needed because they didn't have the meat from the buffalo. They were told by a Paiute prophet that if they performed a ritual called the ghost dance, that their lands and way of life would be restored. So this movement spread among the 25,000 Sioux on the Dakota Reservation to do the ghost dance. This actually scared military officials, and this is when they ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull. 40 Native American police were sent to arrest Sitting Bull. One of those Native American police were shot by a native called Catch the Bear, and the scuffle ensued. As the scuffle ensued, Sitting Bull was actually killed, and Chief Bigfoot took over leading the tribe. And then we have the Battle of Wounded Knee. In 1890, this is kind of the last really big clash or engagement of the U.S. military and the Native Americans. It's not the last, but it's the last really big one. The 7th Cavalry, which had been Custer's unit, rounded up about 350 Sioux that were starving and took them to a camp at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. They demanded that the natives give up their weapons. Somewhere along the way, a shot was fired. Nobody really knows where the shot came from, who fired it first. It's kind of like the beginning of the Mexican War. You don't know exactly how it started. But a shot's fired. In response to that shot being fired, the soldiers open up cannon fire on the Native American camp, and they killed 300 natives who were unarmed. Most of the natives that were killed were women and children or old people, and they weren't even buried. Their bodies were left frozen to freeze on the ground, and it was a Wounded Knee massacre. This was an end to the Indian Wars, but it certainly was not a bright spot in our nation's history. Okay, another reason people came west was because of cattle. Cattle had become big business. Ranching or the cattle business was huge, and the main aspect of that is going to be the cattle drive. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. After the Civil War, ranchers had a lot more cattle than their local markets could take. They just had more beef than the local markets could buy. But there was a huge demand for beef back east. The problem was, how are we going to get the cattle from the west to the east? The Transcontinental Railroad wasn't done yet. It was in the process, but it wasn't ready yet, and there was only one of those. So how were we going to get these cows to the east to sell the meat? And so the cattle drive became the method that was used for this. All right, so vaqueros and cowboys, they're really the same thing. Vaqueros were the Mexican version of a cowboy. I shouldn't say the Mexican version, because vaqueros actually existed before the American cowboy. The American cowboy is modeled after the Mexican vaquero. The buffalo decreased on the plains, and so as there were less and less buffalo eating all the grass, there was room for more and more horses and cattle. And so ranching became very popular, very profitable from Texas to Kansas. Some pictures of some cowboys. So settlers learned from their Mexican neighbors how to manage large herds on the open range. The animals themselves were called longhorns, and you can see from the picture why they were called longhorns. Now, this particular breed of cattle was used because it could withstand the cattle drive to get to the train stations to be able to be shipped back east. It's not the tastiest beef. It's not it's not bad beef. It's just not the tastiest, but it's the hardiest breed, and so that's why they were the chosen breed. They were sturdy. They were accustomed to the dry grasslands of southern Spain. They could be used as food for. They could be used for food, and horses could be used to do the work and the transportation. So vaqueros. This is a Mexican vaquero. You can see how much. You can see how much he looks like the American cowboy. Okay, so the vaquero was the first to wear spurs. Spurs are used to help encourage a horse to do what you wanted to do. Sometimes horses can be a little stubborn, and so sometimes you need the spurs to encourage them to do what you want them to do. They wore chaparras, or leather overalls. We know them as chaps. They ate jerky, or dehydrated dried meat. The wild horse, or the bronco caballo, became known as a bronc. And the Mexican ranchero became the American ranch. We were completely influenced by the Mexicans in this way of life. The cowboy way of life was actually Mexican first. Now, cowboys weren't in great demand until the railroads actually reached the Great Plains. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad and the railroads actually reaching the Great Plains bring about the need for the cowboys. Before that, there were no cattle drives, so you didn't need cowboys to help drive the cattle anywhere because you just didn't do that. But once the railroads had a presence in the Great Plains, you wanted to be able to get the cattle to the railroads so they could be shipped back east. That was the way that you were going to make your money. Well, you had to have a lot of cowboys to be able to do that, to get the herd where it needed to go. Ranchers had stayed on their ranches with their cattle before this, but now there was a reason to go off of the ranch. As I already said, after the Civil War, the demand increased for beef. And early transportation and cattle drives certainly had their problems, but the more that it was done, the more it was perfected. So this is a cow town. Cow towns would build up along the cattle drive, especially where the train station was going to be, because that was the ultimate destination of the cattle drive, was to get to where the train station was. And so towns would grow up there, because once the cowboys got to the cow town or got to the train station, they loaded their cows on the train. They got paid for their cows, and now they had money to spend. They got paid for the cattle drive. And so, they wanted a hot shower. They wanted, they didn't have showers then. They wanted a hot bath. They wanted a bed to sleep in because they had been on a dusty trail. They had been sleeping on the ground. They wanted clean clothes. They wanted a good meal to eat besides tough jerky and beans. They wanted a drink. And so all of these services could be provided in the cow town. They were the most in demand there, and so that's where the town would grow up. Joseph McCoy asked several towns to make plans for a shipping yard where the trails and the rail lines came together. So some people saw the potential there, and they said, hey, this cattle drive's going to end here, this cattle drive's going to end here, all of them are going to kind of end up here. Let's actually build a town there to cater to these needs. And he built cattle pens and a 3-story hotel that helped along the Chisholm Trail, which was one of the most popular trails. And then that's a link to a YouTube video you can watch about that. The Chisholm Trail was a major cattle route from San Antonio, Texas, went through Oklahoma and to Kansas. About 35,000 cattle were shipped out of that yard, out of the yard in Abilene in its first year. The next year it went up to 75,000, so you can see it grew exponentially. Okay, so what was the day in the life of the cowboy like? Well, he worked a 10 to 14-hour day. He generally was between the ages of 15 to his 30s. You weren't a cowboy much after your 30s. It was a hard life. It was a physical life, and it took a toll on the body. Roundup would be in the spring, and you would get the longhorns together, any of them that you could find on the open range. You'd put them in a large canal, and you would brand them to get them ready for the drive. That way, if one got away or whatever, everybody knew which cattle belonged to your ranch. Now, the open range was just public grassland. That's where the cattle would graze throughout the winter and until it was time to get ready for the drive. It was just public land. The grass was open for anybody or anybody's cattle. And so you would go and round them up and bring them into the corral, at the ranch. And once you got them in the corral, you would brand them. Then you would start out on the drive. The drive would actually take about 3 months. It would take you about 3 months of living out in the open air, camping out, sleeping under the stars, eating, like I said, the jerky and the beans and that kind of thing. Take you about 3 months to get the cattle from the ranch to the train station. Every one cowboy had about 250 to 300 cattle that he was responsible for. He had to make sure those cows got where they needed to go. A cook went along and drove the chuck wagon to provide food for the cowboys. Wranglers took care of the horses. And there would be a trail boss. He was in charge of organizing everything and getting you where you needed to go. And he actually learned about $100 a month, which was really good money at the time. Okay, now there's some legends from the West. Some of them come from the cowboy age. Some of them just come from legends. Law and order in the West was somewhat dicey. There was a structure in place, and your book gives you a really good rundown of that. but there are some people who really made a name for themselves in the West. Now, the West was nowhere near as wild as it's depicted in the movies and TV shows. That was done to sell movies. It was relatively a peaceful place, but there were some people who made names for themselves, like James Butler or Wild Bill Hickok. He was a scout and a spy during the Civil War, served as marshal in Abilene, Kansas for a while, and he was known to be a violent man. Again, there's a YouTube link if you want to look that up and learn a little bit more about his life. There's Martha Jane Burke, or Calamity Jane. She was an expert sharpshooter, but she dressed like a man. And she may have been a scout for Custer. We're not sure. There's another video you can watch if you're interested in her. The cattle drive is going to end because of the end of the open range. The open range is going to cease to exist, partly because of overgrazing. Ranching became such a big business that they would have more and more cattle. Well, the more cattle you have, the more grass they eat, and eventually the land becomes overgrazed and it won't support the herds anymore. Also, there's a period of bad weather. In 18, let's see, let me find that date. There's a really bad winter in 1886 and 1887, and large numbers of the herds are actually killed. They die because of exposure. And then barbed wire is invented. Joseph Glidden invents barbed wire. Barbed wire is invented because of the farmers. Remember I said there was the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave 160 acres to any settler who lived on a farm for 5 years and improved it by building a home and farming it. Well, the number one reason for the end of the open range was the opening of the land to farmers. Farmers came to settle the land. They didn't want cattle tramping through their crops, and so they would fence in their land with barbed wire. This is actually going to cause conflict between the ranchers and the farmers, and the ranchers are going to send some of their cowboys, they're going to call them sod busters, to try and force the farmers off the land to keep the open range. However, eventually the ranchers are going to lose. So more and more farmers are coming. They're going to band together, and it becomes a lost cause for the ranchers. We've seen this picture before when we talked about Manifest Destiny, but Manifest Destiny is still continuing at this time. So as the settlers move westward, they move westward to farm. Now, one of the things that really encourages this is the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroads are going to open up the West. From 1850 to 1871, the government is actually going to give the railroads 170 million acres. It's going to happen because up until this point, while everybody was interested in having a transcontinental railroad, investors were scared of the cost of a transcontinental railroad, of building it. So the government is going to try and motivate people to build the railroad. And they're going to do this with two railroad acts. In the first one, they're going to give, railroad companies are going to receive 10 square miles of land for each mile of track that they lay. So for each mile of track that the railroad company would lay towards the Transcontinental Railroad, then on either one side or the other, and it would alternate, of that track, they would get 10 square miles of land. In 1864, that amount actually went up to 20 square mile sections. So about 20 million miles, or 20 million acres of land were given to the railroads just in that act alone. In addition, the government is going to provide loans to the railroads. They can have $16,000 for every mile of track they lay in the plains, $32,000 for every mile of track they lay in the foothills, and $48,000 for every mile of track they lay in the mountains. Now, these are loans, but it does help offset the cost of building the railroad. So two railroads get charters for the Transcontinental Railroad, and that's going to be the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. And they actually race to lay track for the Transcontinental Railroad to see which one can lay more track. The Central Pacific comes from Sacramento, and they are to move eastward. The Union Pacific starts in Omaha, and they are to move westward. And the idea is that they would meet up. Now, the Union Pacific, okay, we're going to talk about the laborers in just a minute. Give you a little bit of information about the Union Pacific. So, the Union Pacific begins in Omaha. It's moving west. It does face some challenges. It mostly has plains area to lay track. So the land doesn't give them a lot of challenges, but they do have some challenges they have to face. It's extremely hot in the summer. There's very limited water, and they've got to deal with Indian attacks. So they've got some challenges to face. They hire mostly Irish immigrant workers, and they are able to lay 1,086 miles of track. The Central Pacific Railroad starts in Sacramento, and it's going to move east. It has some more challenges, or it has some challenges as well, but they have more to do with the land. They have to get through the steep mountain range of the Sierra Nevada, and that means blasting tunnels. So they've got to deal with dynamite. They've got to dig out tunnels. There's a lot of challenges there. They employ mainly Chinese immigrants, and they are able to lay about 688 miles of track. So the labor is hard. Many Civil War veterans went and worked on the railroads, but primarily it was Chinese immigrants and Irish immigrants. There were some African Americans and some Mexican Americans as well, but the Chinese primarily worked for the Central Pacific, and the Irish primarily worked for the Union Pacific. Both companies reached Utah by the spring of 1869, linking the east and west coast. They actually meet up on May 10th, Promontory, Utah. The two sets of tracks were joined with an elaborate ceremony. There were actually 4 different railroad spikes that were used. Your book talks about those. And the travel time from coast to coast went from taking months to taking less than a week. So this is a huge improvement.
Double tapped by accident.
So the Golden Spike is one of the railroad spikes that's used during the ceremony of the joining of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a link that you can use for more information on that if you would like. Homestead Act, I've already talked to you a little bit about. And about 600,000 settlers took advantage of the government offer. They were called exodusters. A lot of them were African Americans because this was their chance to own land and to get out of the Reconstruction of the South. But there were problems. Speculators used the land for their own gain, trying to find gold or other precious metals. Cattlemen wanted the open range, and so they would send the sodbusters. Miners and woodcutters would claim the natural resources. And then in 1869, there was a massive land giveaway in Oklahoma. The problem was Oklahoma was supposed to be Indian territory, and that land was supposed to belong to the Native Americans. The frontier was considered officially closed towards the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. Henry D. Washburn and Nathaniel P. Langford asked Congress to help protect the wilderness from settlement. In 1872, Yellowstone National Park was created. In the Progressive era, we're going to find out that Teddy Roosevelt did a lot to conserve the land, too. 1879, railroads were started to be forced to give up some of their land holdings. And by 1890, the Census Bureau declared that there was no longer a frontier. There were challenges out in the plains, though. For example, homes. The plains did not have a lot of trees, so wood was not readily available to build a home or a barn. So most of the people lived in dugouts or soddies. These were dug into the sides of hills, or they were made out of mud, pretty much. They were The problems with them was that rain, when you did get rain, rain seeps into the ground, which makes everything wet, and your home is basically under the ground, so your home is wet. Your book talks about an account of a settler's wife that would say when it did rain, she would have to make sure she had tight lids on the pots and pans on the stove, because the water would drip through the mud ceiling and drip mud into the food if she didn't. So you could see where this would be a problem. Sadis were only good for a couple of years. Then you would either have to make another sadi, or you would have had to have made enough money to import the wood to build you a proper house. Women's work. Well, there really was no such thing out west. Women and men did pretty much the same work. They plowed the fields, they planted the garden. Wheat generally was the cash crop. They hauled water. Now, the women did tend to make soaps and candies. They canned fruits and vegetables from the garden. They did a lot of the doctoring. A lot of schools and churches were sponsored in an effort to build communities. So farmers in an area would get together and try and pool their resources to have a school or a church or both. There were some technological advancements that helped turn the Great Plains especially into a profitable farming area. The Great Plains had actually been called the Great Desert before the Civil War because it had very little water. It didn't get a lot of rain, and so there was a lot of there wasn't a lot of good farming that was happening there. It wasn't that the soil was bad, but they just didn't have a good steady supply of water. But in 1837, John Deere invented a steel plow, and that worked really well in the hard top layer of soil in the plains. In 1847, Cyrus McCormick began to produce a reaping machine, which meant you had to have less people to harvest the crops so you could plant bigger crops. And by 1890, there were more than 900 manufacturers of farm equipment, so the farm equipment became much more affordable and readily available. These inventions made more grain available for a wider market, which made the grain less expensive. And grain was the primary crop of the Great Plains area. It's why it becomes known as the breadbasket of the world. Another way, there were several ways that they overcame the water problem. Some would irrigate. Some would pump water up out of the table, the water table under the ground by using windmills. Some practiced what was called dry farming, which is where they would conserve water. They would water the crops, but they would use ground cover to help keep the moisture in. And many planted a crop called winter wheat or some other variation of the crop where it would come to maturity before the intense heat of the summer. So by the time the heat of the summer could come in and burn up the crop because it didn't have enough water, the crop would have already been harvested. And this is why this area becomes known as the breadbasket of America, and actually it still is. Agricultural education also advances. The government realizes that there is a need for this, and they finance agricultural education. The Morrill Act of 1862 and 1890 actually gives land to the states to help them finance agricultural colleges. Virginia Tech is one of these colleges. It was primarily an agricultural college in the beginning. The Hatch Act of 1887 established agricultural experimental stations to help farmers find out about new developments and things that would help them become more successful and more profitable. Research helped prairie farmers develop grains for their kind of soil and for dry farming, and this helps lead to the plains becoming the breadbasket of the nation. But farmers have to borrow money for the machinery. When the wheat prices had been high, they had been able to pay this money back really quickly. But the more advancements there were, the more wheat would be planted. The more wheat there was on the market actually drove the price for the wheat down. So that could hurt the profit. Prices falling hurt the profit of the farmer and made it difficult to pay back their debt. So in the 1870s, a new type of farming began called bonanza farming. Railroad companies actually created this along with investors, and they would put a single crop on about 15,000 to 50,000 acres. We would think of this as a commercial farm today. It's kind of the beginnings of a commercial farm. They'd pick one crop, they would take huge amounts of land, just plant that crop, and then hire workers to come in and take care of it. So to be able to compete, farmers would borrow more money, farms would get bigger, but the problem was drought. When drought came, the bonanza farms went bankrupt. And the other problem that Western farmers often faced was the shipping prices of the grain back east or west to the markets. The shipping prices were very high. The railroads a lot of times would charge them extremely high prices. So a lot of their profit would be eaten up in the shipping. And this is going to give way to the populist movement for the farmers. And we're going to talk about the populist movement some in the progressive era. But this kind of helps build the progressive era because the farmers are going to feel like they're getting a raw deal, and this populist movement kind of empowers them. And so they unite, the farmers unite to address these problems. In the 1800s, crop prices were falling, partly because more crops were being able to be grown. Good farming land was becoming scarce. Banks were foreclosing on farmers. Railroads were taking advantage of them by charging really high shipping prices. And things just didn't seem to be going really well. You can see a lot of this if you watch episodes of Little House on the Prairie. Pa is, a lot of times he is lamenting how little he gets for his crops, or how later episodes of the series he talks about being a part of the Grange, which is one of the organizations that comes about during this time. There's also economic distress that's happening at the time. Paper money is printed. It's called greenbacks. Greenbacks can't be traded for gold or silver, and they're not worth as much. Greenbacks get taken out of circulation after the Civil War, so that actually increases the value of any greenbacks that were in circulation at the time, but there are certainly some economic issues. Farmers had to pay back loans with money that was worth more than what they had been loaned. So they had been loaned the money in greenbacks. Then greenbacks were taken out of circulation. That meant that when they used the greenbacks to pay back the bank, they were actually paying back more of a value. So say they had borrowed $100 in greenbacks, then the greenbacks get taken out of circulation. So now they have $10 in greenbacks, but it's actually worth maybe $20. But the bank's not giving them the $20 value, they're giving them the original value. 1867 to 1887, the price of a bushel of wheat fell from $2 down to 68 cents a bushel. And that's a huge decrease in price, and the farmers suffer greatly from it. So the farmers actually want more money introduced into the circulation. They said that will actually put the value of those greenbacks back to where it was when they borrowed the money. And so the Allison Act of 1872 required the government to buy and coin at least $2 to $4 million worth of silver each month, but that still wasn't enough for the farmers. The railroads caused problems by setting high prices for transportation and for grain storage, and the farmers had no other way of getting their grain to the markets than to pay those prices. And so the railroads knew that, and they took advantage of it. So some farmer alliances were put together. In 1867, Oliver Hudson Kelley started the Patrons of Husbandry. It later becomes known as the Grange, and its purpose is to provide a social outlet and educational forum for farmers, but it's eventually going to get involved in politics. They're going to spend time fighting the railroads, trying to come together against the railroads for the high prices. It was supposed to teach members how to organize, set up farmer co-ops, and sponsor state legislation to help regulate the railroads. It sent lecturers from town to town to help educate the people. And it's going to become part of the populist movement. Populism is a movement of the people, or the Populist or People's Party is founded in 1892. The convention is going to be held in Omaha, Nebraska, and the people want reforms to lift the burden of debt from the farmers and to give the people a greater voice in their government. This is what they think will solve their problems. They wanted the money supply to be increased. They wanted a graduated income tax. So it's actually the people who are wanting the first income tax. Well, not the first. There had been one proposed under Lincoln during the Civil War, but the Supreme Court had struck it down. But this is the people actually asking for an income tax now. They wanted a federal loan program. So a lot of the things that we complain about today actually come from this time period, and it's the people who are pushing for them to happen. They want the U.S. senators to be elected by popular vote instead of by state legislatures. Now, the Constitution and the framers of the Constitution had set it up for U.S. senators to be elected by state legislatures so that the states would have a voice in the United States government. The House of Representatives was supposed to be the voice of the people. The Senate was supposed to be the voice of the states. But now there's a push for the U.S. senators to be elected by the people and not the legislatures. They wanted single terms for the president and vice president. So they wanted term limits. You could only serve one term. They wanted secret ballots to be used for voting so that it would end voting fraud. We had talked during the Gilded Age of the political machine and how people could be intimidated or made to vote in certain ways in exchange for necessities. The idea of the Populist Party was that if everybody voted by secret ballot, then nobody would be able to intimidate you about your vote because nobody would know how you actually voted. They wanted an 8-hour workday, and they wanted restrictions on immigration. So this idea of restricting how many immigrants can come in and what they can do and that kind of thing is not new to today. It was actually part of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and part of the Populist Party platform. The populist programs eventually became the platform of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is going to adopt a lot of these towards the end of the Progressive era. The Populist Party is going to believes that the government is responsible for reforming social injustices. So this is the first political party that's going to come forward and say it's the government's job to fix these problems. Then there's the Panic of 1893. This is going to be an economic depression, only they don't call them depressions at that time. They call them panics. The Great Depression actually becomes known as a depression because they thought that was better than calling it a panic. They thought calling it a panic would cause people to be scared. Okay, so farmers are overextended with debts. Railroads have expanded faster than the markets could handle, and some of the railroads were going bankrupt. The gold supply of the government was wearing thin. It was getting low, and there were a lot of things happening at one time causing the people to panic, causing economic panic. So people panicked and started trading paper money in for gold, but remember the supply of gold was low already. It spreads to Wall Street where the prices of stocks fall rapidly and the price of silver plunges, which closes silver mines. Remember, mining had been a huge reason for settling out west and had become very profitable. Investments are going to decline. Consumer purchases, wages, and prices are also going to fall. So this is the typical depression that you see. 3 million people lose their jobs, and many farmers are suffering hunger and unemployment. Okay, so should we use silver or should we use gold? What should we do? Republicans were in the Northeast. Republicans tended to have the people in the Northeast, the support of the people in the Northeast. Democrats tended to have the support of farmers and laborers of the South and West. The central issue of political campaigns was which metal to become the basis of the monetary system. Should we be on a gold standard? Should we be on a silver standard? Silver rights favored, wait for it, silver. Bimetallists said gold or silver could be exchanged for paper money. President Cleveland and the gold bugs wanted the gold gold standard. The gold standard would be the backing of U.S. dollars solely with gold. So in the election of 1896, the Republicans nominate William McKinley. Democrats want a combined gold and silver with an unlimited amount of silver. William Jennings Bryan speaks at the Democratic Convention. William Jennings Bryan is actually a very prominent Democrat at the time. You would do well to look him up and understand him a little bit better. He actually wins the Democratic nomination for president. He's going to run for president several times. He's never going to win, but he's going to run several times. He picks a vice presidential candidate, Arthur Sewall, but people do not like the VP candidate. The end of populism. This is when populism is actually going to be kind of absorbed into the Democratic Party. William Jennings Bryan is going to face some problems. The Gold Bug Democrats nominate their own candidate. Whenever you've got a three-party race, that's going to be a problem for the party that's split. There was weakened support in the cities where people didn't want higher prices, and there weren't enough campaign funds to run the campaign. So McKinley is elected, and populism collapses almost completely. Not completely, because some of its main points get folded into the Democratic platform. But the Populist Party ceases to exist. The legacies of the Populist Party is that the message that the downtrodden could organize and have political impact is heard loud and clear. And this is where we get the idea that people can come together and really make a change. And the other legacy is an agenda of reforms. We see a lot of reforms come from this. Okay, we're going to stop there. There will be another lecture on the Progressive Era, so please make sure to tune into that one. I'll see you in a bit.